In 1960, during the height of the Cold War space race, the Soviet Union officially launched only one manned mission. Yuri Gagarin would not make his historic flight until April of 1961. Yet classified documents discovered in 1967 during routine archive reorganization at the Baikonur Cosmodrome revealed references to something that should not have existed, a mission designated only as Cosmonauta 0. The name appears in maintenance logs, fuel consumption reports, and radio transmission schedules throughout the winter months of 1960. But according to every official record, no human being left Earth's atmosphere under Soviet command that year. The discrepancy remained buried in microfilm archives until a junior archivist named Dmitry Volkov noticed the pattern while cataloging launch data for a commemorative publication. Volkov's supervisor, Alexander Petrov, initially dismissed the findings as clerical errors or training exercise documentation. The space program generated thousands of papers daily, and mistakes were common. But Volkov persisted, spending his own time cross-referencing the anomalous entries. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about the Soviet space program. In a storage facility outside Tyuratam, Kazakhstan, near the launch complex, Volkov located a series of audio recordings labeled with the same designation. The tapes were stored in a section supposedly containing only meteorological data. When played back, they revealed hours of radio communications between ground control and what appeared to be a cosmonaut in orbit. The voice spoke Russian with a slight Ukrainian accent, using proper radio protocols and technical terminology. Most disturbing was that this voice communicated for 6 days longer than any craft of that era could sustain human life. The recordings were dated February 19th through March 2nd, 1960. Ground control operators addressed the speaker as Cosmonaut 0, never using a proper name. The conversations followed standard mission procedures for the first 72 hours, with routine systems checks, orbit calculations, and medical status reports. But beginning on the 4th day, something changed. Cosmonaut 0 began reporting visual anomalies, objects moving outside the spacecraft in formation patterns that defied known orbital mechanics. Ground control responded with standard medical inquiries about oxygen levels and psychological state. The voice remained calm, professional, describing the phenomena with technical precision. These were not the ramblings of someone suffering oxygen deprivation or space psychosis. The cosmonaut spoke like an experienced pilot, observing something unprecedented. By the 6th day, radio contact became intermittent. When transmissions came through, they carried an echo, as if originating from a much greater distance than low Earth orbit. The final recorded exchange occurred on March 2nd at 14:23 hours Moscow time. Cosmonaut 0 reported successful completion of an unspecified orbital maneuver and requested permission to begin descent procedures. Ground control acknowledged and provided landing coordinates in an area of Kazakhstan approximately 200 kilometers northeast of the launch site. After that transmission, the voice of Cosmonaut 0 was never heard again. Volkov attempted to trace the aftermath through additional documentation. He found requisition orders for search and recovery equipment dated March 3, 1960. Heavy transport vehicles, medical teams, and communication specialists were dispatched to the designated landing zone. The recovery operation lasted 11 days, far longer than standard for a successful mission. When teams returned to Baikonur, their after-action reports were classified at the highest levels. The only accessible document from this period was a brief medical examiner's note, filed incorrectly with routine health inspection records. It mentioned the receipt of biological samples requiring specialized containment procedures. The notation indicated these samples were transferred to a research facility in Semipalatinsk, the same region where nuclear weapons testing occurred throughout the 1950s. 3 months after discovering the recordings, Volkov received notice of his transfer to a meteorological station in Siberia. His supervisor, Petrov, was reassigned to a clerical position in Moscow with no access to space program documentation. The audio tapes and related materials were removed from the storage facility. According to official records, they were destroyed due to poor preservation conditions. Though no such problems had been noted during Volkov's investigation, before his transfer, Volkov made copies of several key documents. He kept these hidden until 1967, when he finally shared them with his nephew, a journalism student in Leningrad. The nephew, Pavel Volkov, became obsessed with the mystery of Cosmonaut Zero. He spent 2 years tracking down individuals who might have been involved in the 1960 mission and recovery operation. Most potential witnesses had died or disappeared by the time Pavel began his investigation. However, he located a former communications technician named Boris Kozlov, who had worked at Baikonur during the period in question. Kozlov, suffering from terminal cancer and feeling he had nothing left to lose, agreed to speak with Pavel in late 1968. According to Kozlov's account, recorded on a small tape player in a Moscow hospital room, the Cosmonaut Zero mission was part of an experimental program that predated the official Soviet space efforts by several years. The goal was to test long-duration survival systems and psychological endurance in orbital conditions. Unlike later missions designed for scientific achievement and propaganda value, this program focused purely on pushing the boundaries of human space endurance. Kozlov claimed that Cosmonaut Zero was not the mission's real designation. The actual code name was Experiment Deep Winter, and it involved technologies not officially acknowledged by Soviet space authorities. The spacecraft used propulsion and life support systems based on research conducted at secret installations throughout the remote regions of Kazakhstan and Siberia. Most significantly, Kozlov stated that Cosmonaut Zero's mission was supposed to last only 5 days. When the cosmonaut remained in communication beyond that period, mission controllers faced an unprecedented situation. They had no protocols for extended contact and began improvising responses to maintain communication while trying to understand what was happening. The recovery operation, according to Kozlov, found evidence of spacecraft impact in the designated landing zone. However, the debris patterns and material composition did not match any known Soviet spacecraft design. The recovery teams also reported discovering biological remains, but these were inconsistent with typical re-entry casualties. Kozlov would not elaborate on the specific nature of these findings, stating only that the medical examiner's preliminary report resulted in the entire investigation being transferred to military authorities. Pavel Volkov attempted to verify Kozlov's claims through additional research, but his investigation was cut short when he was arrested in January 1969 on charges related to unauthorized access to state documents. He served 18 months in a labor camp and was released with a permanent prohibition against working in journalism or research fields. The documents that Pavel had inherited from his uncle disappeared during his arrest. When he was released, his apartment had been thoroughly searched, and all materials related to his investigation were missing. Pavel never resumed his research into the Cosmonaut Zero case, becoming instead a factory worker in Volgograd, where he lived until his death in 1993. The story might have ended there, but for a chance discovery in 1967 at a university library in Kiev. A graduate student researching Soviet space program achievements for his thesis found a reference to Cosmonauta Zero in a footnote of a technical paper about orbital mechanics. The paper had been published in a limited circulation scientific journal in 1961 before strict censorship protocols were implemented for space-related publications. The footnote mentioned successful completion of extended orbital endurance trials using advanced life support systems developed through international cooperation. It provided no additional details, but the student, Mikhail Petrov, became curious about this apparent discrepancy with official Soviet space chronology. His advisor warned him against pursuing unauthorized research topics, but Petrov privately continued investigating. Through contacts at various technical institutes across Ukraine and Russia, Petrov learned that several engineers who had worked on early space program projects remembered rumors about experimental missions conducted before the official program began. These engineers, now working in civilian aerospace industries, spoke carefully about their memories. But several confirmed that unusual projects were indeed undertaken in the late 1950s and early 1960s. One former engineer, speaking anonymously, told Petrov that his team had been asked to design life support systems capable of maintaining human survival for periods much longer than any officially announced mission requirements. The specifications called for systems that could sustain a person for up to 3 weeks in space, with minimal external support. At the time, Soviet spacecraft were designed for missions lasting only a few hours or days. This engineer also mentioned that his team had been required to incorporate design elements that seemed to come from outside the normal Soviet research and development channels. Technical specifications and component requirements were provided without explanation of their origin or purpose. The engineer suspected that some aspects of the systems were based on research conducted by captured German scientists, but he could never confirm this theory. The extended life support systems were completed and tested in simulated space conditions during 1959. According to the engineer's recollection, the tests were successful, but shortly after completion, the entire project was transferred to military oversight, and his team was reassigned to other work. He never learned whether the systems were actually used in space missions. Petrov's research led him to examine records from the Semipalatinsk test site, where nuclear weapons development occurred throughout the 1950s. While most documents from that facility remained classified, he found references in published scientific papers to biological research projects conducted there during the same period as the supposed Cosmonaut Zero mission. A 1962 paper on radiation effects in extreme environments mentioned studies of space analog conditions at Semipalatinsk. The research described exposing biological samples to radiation levels and environmental conditions designed to simulate extended space travel. The paper's conclusion noted that some samples showed unexpected adaptive responses to the simulated space environment. More intriguingly, the paper referenced earlier work conducted with recovered orbital specimens that had demonstrated similar adaptive characteristics. No explanation was provided for the source of these specimens, and follow-up papers by the same researchers made no further mention of this work. Petrov attempted to contact the authors of the paper, but learned that the lead researcher had died in a laboratory accident in 1964, and his colleagues had been transferred to other facilities, with no forwarding information available. The laboratory where the research was conducted had been decommissioned and converted to other purposes by the time Petrov began his investigation. Despite these obstacles, Petrov continued searching for evidence related to Cosmonaut Zero throughout the remainder of the 1960s. His persistence eventually led him to a former medical officer who had served at the Baikonur Cosmodrome during the critical period. The officer, Dr. Yevgeny Markov, had retired from military service and was working as a civilian physician in Almaty when Petrov located him in 1969. Dr. Markov initially refused to discuss his military service, citing security oaths and personal safety concerns. However, after several conversations, he agreed to provide limited information about unusual medical protocols he had been required to follow during his time at Baikonur. He insisted that Petrov not record their conversations and never use his real name in any written accounts. According to Dr. Markov, medical staff at Baikonur were occasionally called upon to handle materials and situations that did not fit standard space program procedures. In early 1960, he was part of a medical team that received biological samples requiring extremely specialized containment and analysis procedures. The samples arrived under heavy security escort and were analyzed in a specially constructed laboratory facility. Dr. Markov described the samples as unlike anything he had encountered in his medical training or previous military service. They appeared to be human tissue, but exhibited structural characteristics that were inconsistent with normal human physiology. The cells showed signs of adaptation to environmental conditions that should have been fatal to human life. Most disturbing was that some tissue samples remained metabolically active despite being separated from their source for several days. Standard preservation techniques seemed unnecessary, as the samples maintained their integrity and continued displaying cellular activity without artificial life support. The medical team was unable to explain this phenomenon using conventional medical knowledge. Dr. Markov's team was ordered to document their findings, but never received feedback on their reports or instructions for follow-up research. After completing the analysis, the samples were removed by the same security personnel who had delivered them. The specialized laboratory was decommissioned immediately afterward, and all medical staff involved in the analysis were transferred to different assignments within weeks. When Petrov asked directly whether Dr. Markov believed the samples came from the Cosmonaut Zero mission, the physician would neither confirm nor deny the connection. He would only state that the timeline was consistent and that the extraordinary security measures were unlike anything used for normal space program medical support. Dr. Markov also revealed that during his time at Baikonur, he had been required to prepare medical monitoring equipment for missions that were never officially acknowledged. The equipment was designed to track physiological conditions during extended spaceflight, far beyond the duration of any announced Soviet missions. This preparation occurred several times throughout 1960, always with minimal advance notice and maximum security protocols. The physician's final revelation concerned radio communications he had overheard while working in the medical facility. On several occasions during February and March of 1960, he heard fragments of conversations between ground control and an orbital vehicle. The medical monitoring equipment in his facility was receiving telemetry data from these communications, indicating that someone in space was transmitting detailed physiological information. What made these transmissions unusual was their duration and the stability of the vital signs being reported. According to Dr. Markov's medical training, the telemetry showed physiological responses that should not have been possible during extended weightlessness. The heart rate, brain activity, and other indicators remained remarkably stable throughout the entire monitoring period, suggesting either equipment malfunction or physiological adaptation beyond normal human capabilities. Dr. Markov's account provided the most detailed description of the Cosmonaut Zero mystery that any investigator had obtained. However, like previous witnesses, he disappeared before Petrov could conduct follow-up interviews. In late 1969, Dr. Markov failed to appear for a scheduled meeting with Petrov. Inquiries at his medical practice revealed that he had resigned abruptly and left no forwarding address. Petrov's investigation effectively ended with Dr. Markov's disappearance. The graduate student completed his thesis using only officially acknowledged Soviet space achievements and made no mention of the Cosmonaut Zero mystery in his academic work. However, he preserved his research notes and continued to follow developments in space exploration, hoping that future disclosures might provide additional information about the case. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Petrov occasionally encountered references that seemed related to the Cosmonaut Zero mystery. Technical papers published by former Soviet aerospace engineers working in Western countries sometimes contained footnotes or acknowledgements that hinted at earlier experimental work. However, these references were always vague and never provided specific details about missions or outcomes. In 1987, during the period of glasnost and increased openness in Soviet society, Petrov attempted to revive his investigation through official channels. He submitted requests for declassification of space program documents from 1960, hoping that political reforms would make previously secret information available to researchers. The response to his requests was swift and definitive. Petrov was informed that the documents he sought either did not exist or remained classified for national security reasons. Furthermore, he was warned that continued inquiries into unauthorized space program activities could result in legal consequences, despite the changing political climate. This official response convinced Petrov that the Cosmonaut Zero mystery involved information considered too sensitive for disclosure, even under reformed Soviet policies. He abandoned his efforts to pursue the case through official channels and focused instead on documenting what he had learned through his previous research. Petrov spent several years organizing his notes and attempting to piece together a coherent narrative from the fragmentary evidence he had collected. His reconstruction of events suggested that the Soviet Union had conducted highly experimental space missions during 1960 using technologies and procedures that were never officially acknowledged. According to Petrov's analysis, Cosmonaut Zero represented an attempt to push human space endurance beyond all previously established limits. The mission utilized experimental life support systems and possibly other technologies that allowed survival in space for periods much longer than conventional spacecraft could sustain. The biological samples analyzed by Dr. Markov's team suggested that this extended space exposure had profound effects on human physiology. Whether these effects were beneficial adaptations or harmful mutations remained unclear from the available evidence. The extreme secrecy surrounding the mission and its aftermath indicated that the results were considered too significant or too dangerous for normal disclosure procedures. Petrov theorized that the Cosmonaut Zero mission was connected to broader Soviet research into human adaptation to extreme environments. This research may have been intended to support future long-duration space missions to the Moon or other planets. Alternatively, it could have been part of military research into human survival under extraordinary conditions. The disappearance of witnesses and the destruction of documentary evidence suggested that whatever was learned from the Cosmonaut Zero mission was considered too important or too dangerous to remain in normal channels. The involvement of facilities like Semipalatinsk, known for classified weapons research, indicated that the mission's results may have had military applications beyond space exploration. By the early 1990s, Petrov had developed a comprehensive theory about the Cosmonaut Zero mystery, but lacked definitive proof for his conclusions. The collapse of the Soviet Union provided new opportunities for accessing previously classified information, but also created chaos in archive management that made systematic research more difficult. Petrov made several attempts during the 1990s to locate surviving documentation about the Cosmonaut Zero mission. Former Soviet archives were being reorganized, sold to private collectors, or simply abandoned as government institutions struggled with political and economic changes. Some materials became available to researchers, but much was lost or destroyed during this transition period. In 1994, Petrov learned of an archive sale in Moscow where former military and space program documents were being offered to private buyers. He attended the sale hoping to find materials related to his research. but discovered that most space program documents had already been purchased by foreign collectors or removed by government agents before the public sale. However, Petrov did acquire a small collection of technical manuals and maintenance logs from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Among these documents was a maintenance record that mentioned repairs to deep space communication equipment in March 1960. The record noted that the equipment had been damaged by extended operation beyond design parameters and required complete replacement. This maintenance record provided the first tangible documentation Petrov had found that corroborated witness accounts of the Cosmonaut Zero mission. The timing matched precisely with the period when radio contact with Cosmonaut Zero was supposed to have ended, and the description of equipment damage was consistent with attempts to maintain communication with a spacecraft at much greater distance than normal orbital altitude. Encouraged by this discovery, Petrov intensified his search for additional documentation. Through contacts developed during the archive sale, he learned of a former electronics technician who had worked on communication systems at Baikonur during the relevant period. The technician, Vladimir Smirnov, was living in poverty in a small town outside Moscow and was willing to discuss his experiences in exchange for modest financial compensation. Smirnov provided detailed technical information about the communication equipment used to track the Cosmonaut Zero mission. According to his account, ground control had been forced to use experimental high-power transmitters to maintain contact with the spacecraft after the third day of the mission. These transmitters were normally used only for deep space probe communication and had never been used for manned mission support. The technician described increasingly desperate attempts by ground control to maintain radio contact as the spacecraft's signals became weaker and more distorted. Standard orbit tracking indicated that Cosmonaut Zero should have been easily within range of normal communication equipment, but the signal characteristics suggested the spacecraft was much farther away than calculated position indicated. Smirnov also revealed that audio recordings of the mission communications were made using specialized equipment that captured much more detail than standard radio logs. These recordings included background sounds and signal artifacts that provided additional information about conditions aboard the spacecraft. According to Smirnov, analysis of these detailed recordings revealed anomalies that mission controllers could not explain. Most significantly, Smirnov claimed that the final transmission from Cosmonaut Zero was not the routine request for landing clearance that appeared in official logs. Instead, the spacecraft transmitted a detailed technical report describing encounters with unidentified objects and phenomena during the mission's extended duration. This report was recorded but immediately classified, and Smirnov was ordered to destroy all technical notes related to the transmission. Smirnov's account provided the most comprehensive technical description of the Cosmonaut Zero mission that Petrov had obtained. However, like previous witnesses, Smirnov died unexpectedly before Petrov could conduct follow-up interviews. The technician suffered a heart attack in early 1995, despite having no known history of cardiovascular problems. With Smirnov's death, Petrov lost his last direct link to individuals who had personal knowledge of the Cosmonaut Zero mission. By this time, nearly 40 years had passed since the original events, and most potential witnesses were either dead or impossible to locate. Petrov realized that his investigation had reached its practical limits. In 1996, Petrov compiled his research into a comprehensive report documenting everything he had learned about the Cosmonaut Zero mystery. The report included copies of all documents he had obtained, transcripts of witness interviews, and his analysis of the evidence. He distributed copies to several researchers and journalists interested in Soviet space program history, hoping that others might be able to pursue aspects of the investigation that remained beyond his reach. Response to Petrov's report was mixed. Most mainstream researchers dismissed it as speculation based on fragmentary evidence and unreliable witness testimony. However, several independent investigators found the account compelling and began their own research into related aspects of early Soviet space activities. One of these investigators, Dr. Catherine Morrison, an American aerospace historian, obtained access to declassified CIA documents from the 1960s through Freedom of Information Act requests. Among these documents were intelligence reports describing unusual Soviet space activities during 1960 that correlated with elements of Petrov's account. According to CIA analysis from that period, American intelligence agencies had detected Soviet radio transmissions and radar signatures consistent with space missions that were never officially announced. These activities occurred during February and March 1960, matching the timeline of the supposed Cosmonaut Zero mission. The CIA documents also mentioned attempts by American intelligence to intercept and decode Soviet space communications during this period. While most transmissions were successfully encrypted, intelligence analysts noted that some communications continued for much longer periods than typical Soviet missions, and originated from positions that suggested orbital altitudes much higher than previously observed Soviet spacecraft. Dr. Morrison's research provided independent confirmation that something unusual had occurred in the Soviet space program during 1960. While the CIA documents did not prove the existence of Cosmonaut Zero specifically, they supported the conclusion that secret Soviet space activities were taking place during the relevant time period. Building on Morrison's findings, other researchers began examining American military and NASA records from 1960 for additional evidence of unacknowledged Soviet space missions. This research revealed that American space tracking systems had detected several unexplained orbital objects during the first quarter of 1960. These objects displayed orbital characteristics that were inconsistent with any known Soviet spacecraft designs. They remained in orbit for periods much longer than Soviet technology should have allowed, and some appeared to change orbital parameters in ways that suggested active propulsion systems far more advanced than anything the Soviet Union was known to possess. American military analysts at the time had classified these observations as possible evidence of advanced Soviet space weapons development. However, the objects never displayed hostile behavior and eventually disappeared from tracking systems without explanation. The incidents were filed as unsolved intelligence puzzles and largely forgotten as the American space program focused on more immediate competitive challenges. The correlation between these American observations and the Cosmonaut Zero timeline provided additional circumstantial evidence supporting Petrov's theory. However, the classified nature of much relevant documentation continued to prevent definitive verification of the case's key elements. In 2003, nearly 45 years after the original events, a final piece of evidence emerged that added new complexity to the Cosmonaut Zero mystery. During renovation of a building that had housed Soviet space program administrative offices, workers discovered a hidden cache of documents that had been sealed inside a wall cavity. Among these documents was a medical report dated March 1960 that described examination of an individual identified only as Subject Zero. The report detailed physiological changes consistent with extended exposure to space environment conditions, but noted several anomalies that the examining physician could not explain using conventional medical knowledge. According to the report, Subject Zero displayed enhanced resistance to radiation, improved cardiovascular efficiency, and neurological modifications that suggested adaptation to weightless conditions. However, the subject also exhibited psychological changes that the physician described as profound alteration of baseline human behavioral patterns. Dreed. The medical report concluded that Subject 0 represented either an extraordinary example of human adaptability or evidence that extended space exposure could fundamentally alter human physiology in ways that were not fully understood. The physician recommended immediate transfer of the subject to a specialized research facility for comprehensive study. This medical report was the first documentary evidence that anyone had returned from the Cosmonaut Zero mission. Previous accounts had suggested that the mission ended in disaster or disappearance, but the medical examination indicated that at least one person had survived and undergone medical evaluation. However, the report raised as many questions as it answered. The identity of Subject 0 remained unknown, and the document provided no information about what happened after the medical examination. The sophisticated medical terminology and detailed physiological descriptions suggested genuine scientific observation, but the extraordinary nature of the reported changes strained credibility. Analysis of the document's paper, ink, and typewriter characteristics confirmed that it was created during the early 1960s, using materials and equipment consistent with Soviet medical facilities of that era. However, experts could not definitively verify the authenticity of the content or determine whether it represented actual medical observations or speculative fiction designed for unknown purposes. The discovery of this medical report renewed interest in the Cosmonaut Zero mystery among researchers and conspiracy theorists. However, by this time, the case had become so surrounded by speculation and conflicting accounts that serious academic investigation was virtually impossible. The story of Cosmonaut Zero remains unresolved. Despite decades of investigation by multiple researchers, no definitive proof has emerged to confirm or refute the central claims. The fragmentary evidence suggests that something extraordinary occurred in the Soviet space program during 1960, but the nature and significance of those events remain matters of speculation. What is certain is that numerous individuals connected to early Soviet space activities believed that secret experimental missions were conducted during this period. Whether these missions involved the specific events described in the Cosmonaut Zero accounts, or whether the story represents a conflation of multiple classified projects, cannot be determined from available evidence. The systematic disappearance of witnesses and destruction of documentation makes further investigation unlikely to yield definitive answers. The secrets of Cosmonaut Zero, whatever they may have been, appear to have died with the people who possessed first-hand knowledge of the events. Today, the abandoned launch facilities at Baikonur stand as monuments to both the triumph and mystery of early space exploration. Among the official memorials to celebrated cosmonauts and historic missions, there is no mention of Cosmonaut Zero. Yet for those who know where to look, traces of the mystery remain visible in maintenance records, technical specifications, and the careful omissions in official chronologies. The wind that sweeps across the Kazakhstan steppes carries no voices from the past, no echoes of radio transmissions from spacecraft that may never have officially existed, but in the vast silence between Earth and the stars, some mysteries endure, waiting for a truth that may never come to light. Perhaps that is as it should be. Some boundaries of human knowledge were meant to remain unexplored, and some pioneers were destined to venture into darkness that no official record would ever acknowledge. In the end, Cosmonaut Zero remains what all great mysteries should be, a reminder that even in an age of scientific certainty, the universe still holds secrets too profound for ordinary understanding. The final chapter of this investigation came to light in 1968, when a maintenance worker at the Baikonur Cosmodrome discovered something that had been overlooked for 8 years. While cleaning out a storage facility scheduled for demolition, he found a single audio cassette tape wedged behind a filing cabinet. The tape was labeled simply CZ Final Log March 2. When played, the recording contained what appeared to be a personal message from Cosmonaut Zero, recorded separately from the official mission communications. The voice was the same as in the previous recordings, but the tone had changed. Gone was the professional detachment of the earlier transmissions. This final message carried an emotional weight that suggested someone preparing to disappear forever. The cosmonaut spoke quietly, almost whispering, describing a view of Earth that no human had ever seen before. From an altitude far beyond normal orbital distance, the planet appeared as a small blue sphere suspended in infinite darkness. But more disturbing was what the voice described, seeing in that darkness patterns of movement, formations of objects that suggested intelligence, purpose, organization, on a scale that dwarfed human understanding. "I have seen what waits beyond our small world," the voice said. "And I understand now why some knowledge must remain hidden. What we call empty space is not empty at all. We are not alone, and we are not ready for what lies in the vast between. I go now to join them, to learn what cannot be taught, to become what cannot be spoken. Tell them I succeeded beyond all expectations. Tell them the mission continues, even though I can never return." The recording ended with the sound of switches being activated and systems shutting down. Then silence. This tape was the last evidence ever found related to the Cosmonaut Zero mission. The maintenance worker who discovered it turned it over to his supervisor, who immediately contacted security personnel. Within hours, the recording had been confiscated, and the maintenance worker transferred to a different facility. But before the tape disappeared into classified archives, 3 people heard its contents. The maintenance worker told his wife. The supervisor mentioned it to a colleague. That colleague wrote a brief note about it in his personal diary. Through these fragmented accounts, the existence of the final recording became known to investigators decades later. The message on that tape, if genuine, suggested that Cosmonaut Zero had not died or disappeared in the conventional sense. Instead, the mission had evolved into something beyond human comprehension, beyond the boundaries of normal space exploration. Whether this represented triumph or tragedy remained impossible to determine. In the years that followed, occasional reports emerged from remote regions of the Soviet Union describing strange lights in the night sky, moving in patterns unlike any known aircraft or spacecraft. These sightings occurred most frequently in Kazakhstan, near the areas where Cosmonaut Zero was supposed to have landed. Local residents spoke of silent objects that appeared briefly before vanishing into the stellar darkness. Most such reports were dismissed as misidentification of conventional aircraft or natural phenomena. But a few investigating officers noted that the witnesses described movement patterns consistent with objects under intelligent control, following trajectories that suggested familiarity with local geography and terrain. These sightings continued sporadically through the 1970s and 80s, always in remote areas where few witnesses were present. The descriptions remained remarkably consistent. Silent objects moving purposefully through the night sky, visible only briefly before disappearing. Some witnesses reported seeing what appeared to be a human figure, visible through transparent portions of these objects. The last confirmed sighting occurred in 1986, exactly 26 years after the original Cosmonaut Zero mission. A geological survey team working in central Kazakhstan reported observing an object that matched previous descriptions. But this time, the encounter lasted several minutes rather than seconds. According to their report, the object approached their camp in the early morning hours and hovered silently approximately 100 meters above the ground. Through what appeared to be a transparent section of the craft, team members observed a human figure wearing what looked like a modified spacesuit. The figure appeared to be observing their activities with instruments they could not identify. When team members attempted to signal the object using flashlights, it responded with a series of light pulses that formed no recognizable pattern. After several minutes of this exchange, the object rose vertically and disappeared into the darkness above. No sound was heard throughout the entire encounter. The geological team's report was filed with local authorities and eventually reached military intelligence offices. An investigation was conducted, but no explanation was found for the sighting. The team members were questioned extensively and their accounts found to be consistent and credible. However, no follow-up investigation was authorized. This final sighting marked the end of documented encounters related to the Cosmonaut Zero mystery. Whether these incidents represented genuine contact with the lost cosmonaut or were elaborate hoaxes designed to perpetuate the legend cannot be determined from available evidence. What remains certain is that the Cosmonaut Zero case represents one of the most thoroughly documented yet completely unresolved mysteries in the history of space exploration. The consistency of witness accounts, the correlation with independent intelligence observations, and the systematic suppression of evidence all suggest that something extraordinary occurred in 1960. Whether that something involved advanced Soviet space technology, contact with extraterrestrial intelligence, or human transformation beyond current scientific understanding may never be known. The participants in these events carried their secrets to their graves, and the documentation they left behind raises more questions than it answers. The abandoned facilities at Baikonur Cosmodrome continue to deteriorate under the harsh Kazakhstan sun and wind. Tourist groups occasionally visit the historic launch sites, learning about officially acknowledged achievements in space exploration. No mention is made of experimental missions or lost cosmonauts who may have ventured beyond the boundaries of human knowledge. But sometimes, in the deep silence of the steppe night, local guides point toward the stars and mention old stories their grandparents told about lights that moved with purpose through the darkness. They speak carefully, uncertain whether these tales represent memory or imagination, history or folklore. In the end, perhaps it does not matter. The mystery of Cosmonaut Zero serves as a reminder that human understanding of the universe remains incomplete. For every question answered by scientific investigation, new mysteries emerge to challenge our assumptions about what is possible and what lies beyond our current reach. The cosmos is vast, ancient, and filled with phenomena that dwarf human comprehension. In that context, the story of one cosmonaut who may have ventured too far into the unknown becomes both a warning and an invitation. Some boundaries exist to be crossed, while others may be better left undisturbed. Whatever truth lies behind the Cosmonaut Zero mystery, it remains hidden among the stars, waiting for a future generation that may be better prepared to understand its implications. Until then, the story endures as testimony to human courage in the face of the infinite unknown, and as a reminder that some journeys lead to destinations from which there can be no return. The wind across the steppes carries no answers, only questions that echo through the vast silence between Earth and the unreachable stars.